Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, I'm Shannon. I'm your court reporter for the day.
Good morning.
Pleasure to
Welcome.
meet everybody. Thank you.
I will try to check in with you when we go on the record. We take breaks and we come back. I will try to remember to check in, make sure you're ready for us to go back on the record. But um, let me know, and then also don't be afraid, please, to speak up if you need a break. We will have regular breaks, but if you,
Okay, yeah, I'm good on that. I doubt I'd ever need to ask for that, but I'm just glad this went through. I was having a little difficulty signing on, but I guess everybody was at the last minute, so I feel better now.
yeah, we hold everyone in the waiting room. So
Okay, that's fine. That's fine as long as I'm not the only one in the waiting room.
great. And I will look to the room. I'm going to get started shortly. I think looks like we have everyone.
Here now.
Attempting to connect. So I will go ahead and start with our introductions. Good morning. It is October
Deal.
22nd, 2024. I think there's someone who needs to, oh, Mr. Reese, I'm going to put you on mute if I can, or one of my team will. Good morning, October 22nd, 2024. I am Nicole Kinsey, presiding hearing officer for the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. This is the hearing on the pending petition for assignment of state filed application 25517 and accompanying water right application 25517X01 and the pending request for release from priority of state filed applications 25513, 25514, the unassigned portion of 25517, 22235, 23780, and 23781 in favor of water right application 25517X01 of Sites Project Authority. As usual, we are conducting today's hearing by Zoom, and the hearing is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. Both the audio and video are being recorded, and we will post files of those recordings in the FTP folder for this proceeding, and the YouTube recording will also be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. If you're expecting technical difficulties today, trying to communicate with us or accessing the Zoom platform, please send us an email. The AHO staff will be monitoring the email inbox. As happened yesterday, um, if I am having technical difficulties and I'm not able to rejoin Zoom in short order, one of the AHO staff will call a brief recess until I can reconnect. As usual, we will take breaks today. We will have a lunch break and we will have a hard stop at 5 p.m. We again have Ms. Mullen assisting us today. So witnesses and attorneys, please feel free to address Ms. Mullen directly if you would like her to bring up a particular exhibit or advance your slides. With that, we're carrying over appearances as usual. Where we left off yesterday, as I recall, was Mr. Ferguson was in the process of cross-examination.
I understand.
I have someone needs to go on mute. I'm not sure who it is.
Muted so she can't hear us.
I'll have my team look to the, there we go.
Yeah, good morning, Hearing Officer Kinsey. I just heard from Mr. Reeves that they can't hear, I guess we can hear them, and they can't hear you. So they
Oh.
are working on that right now. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. And let me know thank you for communicating that. If that continues, we can also take a break if we need to.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure. We saw them just there on the screen, so I know they're ready to go. But apparently the sound, which I know happens sometimes when there's an update, so I'm not sure.
It's Zoom usually works okay for me. It's Teams that's my nemesis, so I understand that.
Same here, but every once in a while there's a gremlin in there. So I believe they'll be able to work it out. I think maybe they're going in and out to see if that does it. I think they
It looks like I have a little bit of housekeeping. I won't jump into that, so we'll get to that and we'll see where we are shortly.
Perfect.
Thank you. And for the rest, I think as I was trying to update, I think where we left off was cross-examination by Mr. Ferguson of Mr. Wilson. And then we would proceed through the other cross-examiners with respect to that panel. And I don't have any procedural issues. No, I do have one procedural issue that I wanted to address first, and then I'll turn to you, Mr. King. I wanted to mention, I don't know if Ms. Willie is on today for Save California Salmon, but maybe if one of the other attorneys could convey this, I can also follow up with an email. We received the errata exhibits from Save California Salmon, and the way they were numbered were as new. I think it was errata testimony, updated slightly revised, updated testimony, but they were numbered with new exhibit numbers, and I'm concerned that might be a little confusing. So we were going to renumber them with the original exhibit number and then note that they were errata or corrected. That was our intent, but I wanted to let Ms. Willie know so that there wasn't confusion there about where those exhibits had gone. But I can bring that up later. So that was my one minor housekeeping issue. And with that, I will turn to Mr. King. Did you have something you'd like to raise?
Good morning. I apologize for the housekeeping. I've been away for a couple days and I'm responding to the Fifth Amended notice. So I guess my first question is really around this October 23rd date and what the intent of that was. My understanding is that we're supposed to identify exhibits that are supposed to be part of the evidentiary record. Is that different than what we've already submitted? And then how does the AHO exhibits fit into the scope of that October 23rd date?
So my intent there was to ask parties and to identify, just as an exhibit number range, which of your exhibits that you've already submitted exhibits to the AHO, and which of them you intend to offer into the evidentiary record. For most people, and I assume for you, it will be all of them. But there are times, especially when we have complicated matters, there are times where certain exhibits may not have, for whatever reason, may not be offered, or there are errata instead of the original exhibit. So the original would not be offered, but the errata would be offered into the record. So it's helpful to have a very clean list of what exactly is being offered into the record. In your case, it may just be a simple range. So I didn't intend it to be complicated. It was more for those parties who have errata or have cross-examination exhibits. I know you had some cross-examination exhibits, and just making sure that we have all of those in our list as to what's being offered in.
This is by end of day tomorrow. Is that right? End of
Yes,
business day or
please.
end of day is
End of day is fine.
day,
End
okay,
of the
great.
day. And a simple email is fine. It's just for us to have a record in writing so that I and all the other parties are aware of which exhibits you intend to offer into the evidentiary record.
Right, and then specifically about the AHO how are you looking at the AHO exhibits? I think there's 270 or so of them. Are they going to be part of the record, or do we have to?
The intent is that those will be offered. Once again, the AHO is not exactly sponsoring them, but they will be offered into the record. But we are receiving objections on those, so there may be, and I think I put in the notice, there may be relevancy objections. My intent is not to go through and think, do a double check, is this relevant in light of all of this? That's up to the parties to object to them, but the intent is that they would all be offered into the record, and then we can see if there are any objections, and if there are objections, then others would have a chance to respond and say, no, I think that should come in for the following reason, that kind of thing.
Right, and specifically the protests, which is the protests of different parties as part of the AHO record. And so should I identify, just say generally, and then specifically like the EIS documents, is that what you want from us, or?
That's up to you. It's as I said, the default is going to be that the AHO exhibits will be offered into the evidentiary record, and then objections will be heard.
And
So
so
you don't need to do anything. I'm sorry, you don't need to go do anything proactively to have those offered into the record.
Okay, so if there are objections, then we'll have a chance to actually respond to the objections. Is that the intent?
Yes.
Okay, and then my understanding is that the authority is objecting to all of my testimony. How is the site visit testimonies considered as part of evidentiary record, and are they objecting to my testimony at the site visit also?
My understanding, and I will look to the authority for clarification, but my understanding is that the objection we received from the authority applies to your written testimony. I don't have the exhibit number off the top of my head, but well, I might. But it applies to, let's see here,
The written,
King 68, I
okay.
believe, your written
Okay.
testimony. And that's my understanding of the objection, having not looked at it in recent history, but well, recent history, but lately. But I will look to, I don't know, Mr. Hitchings, if you care to respond to this, or another member of your team. I'm not sure who the appropriate person is as to the scope of your objections to Mr. King's testimony.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. We haven't made a decision on with regard to any of the testimony during the site visit, but we do expect to lodge objections as we indicated during the cross-examination and Mr. King's direct.
All right, thank you. So, Mr. King, I think it remains to be seen, and that will be, it's in my own notice, but those will be lodged, I believe, on November 4th. Is that the deadline? No, sooner.
I believe it's this Friday, October 25th.
I think
great.
that's right. That we have
And
them by
And then
November.
my last question, I'm not sure if Mr. Hitchings would respond or not, but my understanding is that on the hydrology expert for the EIS was not David's Engineering or Mr. David's. It was the person who actually did the fluvial testimony. Is that right? When they submitted their panel, they necessarily didn't have to submit people who actually worked on the EIS. My question is, who was the hydrology expert for the EIR and EIS? And secondly, was David's Engineering part of that? And I'm not sure if it's appropriate for his response or not, but I'm trying to work through the potential rebuttal and going forward. So I don't know if he can respond to that or not.
Well, I'll just say, Mr. King, our case in chief testimony exhibits speak for themselves. So you can re-review them and decide what you need to put on a rebuttal. But our case in chief has been submitted and our witnesses have been excused, and you can make those decisions as you may need to.
Okay. All right, that's fair enough. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you. Is that, did we address everything, Mr. King? Yes, your hand is down.
Yes, thank you. And I apologize to Mr. Burke and Mr. Ferguson for interrupting the proceedings at this point, but thank you for the time and the explanations. Thank you.
No, thank you. And it sounds like we had some technical challenges anyway. Let's see. I will look to the gallery view. Do we have Mr. Reese? How are we? I see Mr. Wilson.
We are good.
Okay, great.
Sorry for that problem.
That's okay. Is there anything else procedurally we should address before we jump back in with Mr. Ferguson and Mr. Wilson? All right, then with that, I will turn things over to you, Mr. Ferguson. You will want to come off, you're probably planning it, but you'll want to come off mute. There you go.
Morning, Mr. Wilson.
Good morning, Mr. Ferguson.
Yesterday we left off at questions regarding paragraphs 14 through 16 in your testimony, which start on page 10.
Correct.
And I'd like to ask you a kind of a broader question about the purpose of these paragraphs. In these paragraphs, you analyze changes in flow in the Sacramento River associated with sites diversions. And is that correct?
Yes.
And my understanding is that you're attempting to connect potential sites diversions from the Sacramento River to exceedances of agricultural water quality objectives at the South Delta salinity compliance locations in Table 2 of D1641. Is that correct?
What I was looking to do is to evaluate the impacts of sites diversions on water quality in the South Delta. And so, as a starting point, took a look at the historical water availability analysis tool in order to get the basic idea of what what's going on with the flows and the diversions over a historical period of time of somewhat recognizable. And
Okay. You suggest that evidence of sites potential diversions of the last pulse flow in specific years and exceedances of salinity objectives in the South Delta in those years demonstrate that there's the potential for impacts to South Delta water quality from diversions by sites project. Is that correct?
well, the main area where I'm looking at the impacts to water quality in the South Delta due to sites diversions is in the reduction of freshwater outflow, which would then result and allow in more seawater or water with higher EC to intrude more into the delta, and during pumping actions then results in increased EC in the South Delta. So I was looking at that in terms of cause and effect and what the effect of the South Delta sites diversions might have on South Delta water quality.
Okay, so just to confirm here, in paragraphs 14 through 16, we're talking about sites diversions from the Sacramento River, and we're not talking about rediversion of water at the export. Okay, good. You've not offered any evidence that changes in Sacramento River flow generally have an effect on salinity at the D1641 South Delta compliance locations, have you?
The information and analysis I did is qualitative. So, yeah.
Okay.
There is no quantitative analysis at this time contained in my
And so if I were to ask you the same question with respect to changes in salinity in the Sacramento River and how that may impact salinity in the South Delta, you haven't done any sort of quantitative analysis in that of that relationship, have you?
Correct, I haven't.
Okay. So I'd like to ask you a question about the 117-day antecedent condition that exists that you mentioned in your testimony. And my understanding of that is there's some evidence that conditions that exist in the Delta may reflect what occurred hydrologically throughout the system up to 117 days prior. Is that accurate?
Correct.
Okay. So assuming changes in Sacramento River flow have an effect on salinity at the D1641 South Delta compliance locations, and the salinity levels in the Delta reflect conditions present up to 117 days prior, then any of the exceedances that you show in your Excel spreadsheet in SDWA 73 that are 117 days after sites stops diverting could not be attributable to sites diversions, correct?
The analysis and the information in the literature would indicate that. So I think you're asking it backwards. I'll try to restate it forwards, that if sites diversions occurred 4 months later, their impacts would have worn off or have ended. And so that's the reason that I cited that particular piece of literature was to make that point, that the Delta, that impacts in the Delta are not one day to the next, but last up to, in that study, they use 117 days.
Okay, thank you. My understanding of why you prepared your analysis using the site's historical tool is because you said in your testimony prior to those paragraphs that the omission of the most recent 2 decades from the analysis of changes in Sacramento River flows and delta outflows in calcium-2 and DSM-2 limits their value as an informational tool. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what is your basis for stating that the analyses are of limited value because they do not include the past 2 decades?
Well, when you look at looking historical analyses, and you look at the historical record that's used for calcium-2, which is 1922 through 2003, there are numerous or a couple things that have changed that make the emission of the most recent 2 years reduce the usefulness. And one would be climate change. So it's well established that the climate is changing, and that's impacting runoff and weather patterns. And then secondly, the period from 1999 through the present is when D1641 is in effect, and also when a majority of the additional export restrictions, such as biological opinion requirements, have been in effect. And so in looking at, in omitting the most recent 2 decades or that period, you lose a lot of the value of what of the historical flows in that the regulatory regime that those flows occurred under is more similar to what will be going forward.
Okay. Are you aware of an alternative to calcium-2 and maybe more specifically DSM-2 that would be an effective model for looking at delta hydrodynamics?
Well, and excuse me for a sec. First, I looked to schism, and the only reason I would look to that is that is the board's or that model has been developed under the at the direction of the State Water Board, and it was developed as a result of issues with the DSM-2 modeling and the ability to predict flow and salinity in the South and Central Delta. And then what I would recommend and advise would be a slightly different use of DSM-2, where you look at individual years where available and determined if you could model some of the sub-monthly impacts and use DSM-2 that way. And the issue with my issue with the methodology, and it's only an issue with regards to mainly an issue with regards to predicting impacts in the South Delta, is that when you have a sub-monthly impact that's not occurring all the time, and you start to average multiple years, multiple different types of water, or multiple water years of the same type, what ends up happening is that individual effects get washed out by being averaged with years or time periods where there's no effect.
Okay. Well, the sub-monthly analysis you're suggesting still sounds like it would rely on DSM-2. Is that accurate?
That is correct. And But I think also when you rely on DSM-2 or you use DSM-2 results, you have to take those results with the appropriate grain of salt, so to speak. So you have to understand the limitations and then take your actions that you use based on these models appropriately.
Are you aware that the sites modeling using DSM-2 shows effectively no increases in exceedances of water quality objectives at the Southern Delta salinity compliance points?
Yes.
Okay. Do you agree that DSM-2 modeling and the modeling that was used for the sites project in particular simulates the effects of antecedent conditions? Are you familiar with that?
DSM-2 simulates the effects of antecedent conditions, but an issue that I raised in my testimony is that when you combine calcium-2 input, which is 30-day average or monthly average input, and you put that into DSM-2, which requires 15-minute time interval input, you have to start making assumptions with your calcium-2 input. And so depending on how you make those assumptions, you can either take a look and look at conditions and maybe get a real picture of what's going on in certain water conditions, or you can also take because you average a bunch of months together and average a bunch of different years together that are the same water year type, you can wash out impacts. And so care needs to be taken in how you both set up your DSM-2 run and how you interpret the results.
Okay. Are you aware of whether the 117-day value that we just discussed is based on DSM-2 simulations?
Yes, it is.
It is. Okay. So I'd like to move to page 14 of your testimony. And lines 19 through 21. You state that delta salinity depends on the long-term memory of contributing parameters, Sacramento River inflow being the most significant, correct?
Well, I say among the most significant.
Okay, thank you. Do you agree that San Joaquin River flow is a significant factor in South Delta salinity?
Yes.
And do you agree that San Joaquin River salinity is an important factor in South Delta salinity?
Yes.
Are you aware of whether the flows in the San Joaquin River at Vernalis were relatively low during the exceedance periods you identified in your analysis in SDWA 73?
In general, I did not
can I clarify the question, Mr. Wilson? I'm sorry, I think I left something out. I just wanted to ask you whether you're aware of whether San Joaquin River flows at Vernalis were relatively low during the exceedance periods that you identified in SDWA 73. And that's a pretty broad question, I realize.
Yeah, and I'm going to object. It's vague, and it assumes facts, but it is vague in terms of what is relatively low.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I'll move on. At lines 21 through 26 on that same page, Mr. Wilson, you state that conditions, in addition to the authorities proposed SDVP, CVP term, are needed to protect Central Delta Water Agency and South Delta Water Agency from impacts to water quality that could last for 4 months, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And in paragraph 28 on page 22, to address this issue, you suggest an adjustment to the authority's diversion period by moving the period to December 1st through March 31st. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Okay. And you suggest that this condition, this adjustment, excuse me, would eliminate the potential for April and May peak flows to be reduced and affect in delta salinity for 4 months, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Or I say up to 4.
Up to 4 months. Okay. With respect to the elimination of the potential for April or May peak flows to be reduced by sites diversions, only one of the 5 years you provided figures for on pages 11 through 13 show diversions in the April-May period. Is that correct?
Yes,
And just for a few days in April, is that correct?
that's correct.
And that was 2016.
That's correct.
Okay. Are you aware that sites potential diversions in April through June essentially only occur in wet years? For the most part.
I would say that the water availability tool shows that those diversions occurring based on the historical hydrology, mostly during above normal and wet years. Yes.
Would you agree that at least in wet years, salinity exceedances anywhere in the delta are generally not occurring and not common?
That's correct.
Okay. So in pages 15 and 16 in paragraphs 17 and 18, you include a figure from the 2010 scientific basis report and state that this figure provides a depiction of the impacts of high export pumping and relatively low inflows. Is that correct?
I believe it's the 2017 scientific basis report.
Oh, okay, excuse me. Okay.
Yes.
So if we turn to the figure, which is on page 16, you state that the figure shows the potential impacts of the inclusion of Clifton Court, Forebay, and Jones Pumping Plant as points of rediversion pursuant to application 25517X01, correct?
That's correct.
Are you aware that sites releases for rediversion at Clifton Court and Jones Pumping Plant will be subject to carriage water requirements?
Yes, and I'd like to add that I did a look at the carriage water requirements, and I would ask that you clarify specifically. There are some nuances to carriage water, but in general, then I think you can more specifically define carriage water if possible. If it helps, you can carry a unit of water across the delta to pump without theoretically affecting the location or water quality, but independent of the objectives, in this case are D1641, or with respect to the objectives in D1641. And that's a nuanced point, but that's just something I wanted to bring up when you address carriage water.
Okay. Well, I have some documents we could certainly bring up, but and they are somewhat general. They state that, yes, that rediversions will comply with the carriage water requirements that DWR and the Bureau determined are necessary or appropriate. So would you like, we can look at those passages, or is that sufficient for me to articulate it at that level of detail? Because I don't have any more detail than that.
That's sufficient.
Okay.
We're talking about carriage water, and we're talking about typically is as used for water transfer.
Yes.
Correct. Thank you.
Okay. And if I get to a question where you feel like you don't have enough detail on carriage water and you can't answer it, then let me know.
I will.
Okay. Do you agree just generally that carriage water is intended to provide an increase in outflow and prevent the arrow on the right-hand panel from the bay from getting bigger?
And you're talking about the curly arrow in the right-hand panel.
Coming from the bay into the South Delta.
Yeah, I just might suggest it might be good to have this.
Can we bring it up?
on
Yeah,
the
that's a
screen.
good idea. Sorry for talking over you, Mr. Ruiz.
No problem.
So can we bring up SDWA 72 A, please, and turn to page 16. Okay, great, thank you. And can we scroll down a little bit? Yeah, so I'm going to ask my question again, and then we can look at the arrows. Okay, Mr. Wilson. So do you agree that carriage water is intended to provide an increase in outflow and prevent the arrow moving from left to right here, coming from the bay, that's shown in the right panel from getting bigger?
I would agree that carriage water is intended to protect water quality in the Delta while transferring water across the Delta and exporting water. In this figure, I would agree that a qualitative analysis would be that the carriage water is intended to prevent the curly arrow that goes from left to right down from to prevent that type of reverse flow and prevent the intrusion of salinity and seawater into the interior delta.
Okay. So assuming, well, you agree that sites is going to be subject to some level of carriage water requirement, correct?
The information that I read, I believe it's in the site's draft operating plan, states that the water will be moved in accordance with transfer procedures. And I would say it's very likely that DWR will assess a carriage water cost, so to speak, to the site's rediversions.
Okay, and so that carriage water will ensure that rediversion of sites water at Clifton Court and Jones Pumping Plant will not contribute to the reversal of tidally average flows depicted in the right panel, correct?
What the carriage water will do is it's intended to address the general losses that occur when water is released north of the Delta and exported south of the Delta. Now, you've got to understand a couple of things about carriage water. Is that first, carriage water is calculated at the end of the season using DSM-2, and thus is a result of an average of the entire summer season. So it's not an instantaneous amount, so for example, that, based on, something that occurs each day that water is released and exported. It's an estimate of the average amount over the entire summer, or typically the summer period, that's calculated. Now, secondly, I've looked at the carriage water percents used for the Yuba transfer since 2008, and they happen to arrive on numbers. They're 20%, 25%, 30%, or 35%. So you notice there is no 27.8%. This implies to me that the carriage water calculations have certainly some error involved in them. And so they're not reported in a manner, they're reported in a manner that shows that there's rounding going on. And then thirdly, I'd like to point out that the carriage water calculations, because they're made after the fact, they don't actually impact that day's pumping. That day's pumping is based on the operators looking at the inflow data and exporting as much water as they can, which is their job, and still meet the objectives that they've been directed by their management to meet. If, for example, sites rediversions were to occur while a temporary change order was in effect, and the D1641 Table 3 objectives for the protection of fish and wildlife beneficial uses, such as export limits, are relaxed, the water that would be pumped, the carriage water would be based on those relaxed objectives. And so I think that the carriage water is a good tool for estimating the losses over the delta, assuming that it's acceptable to you to average over the entire season. And it's a tool that's used once the water is exported to determine whose water amongst the various contractors it is. So I would point out that, in going back to the figure, that the carriage water is certainly intended to prevent the left arrow, the kind of seawater intrusion depicted by the left arrow from occurring, but whether or not it guarantees that it doesn't occur, you have to look a little bit further into it.
Okay, but that is the intention.
Correct.
Okay. So I want to come back to one thing I think you said about the fact that the carriage water amount varies. I think you said it's indicative of error in the calculation. Is that correct?
No.
Or error in you said there's error, so maybe can you explain what you're...
Sure. When you see, say, a series of the carriage water over 10 water year, and just, I guess, to back up real quick, the carriage water percent is dependent upon, say, maybe the water year type. So, for example, in a drier year or drier conditions, it would take a little bit more, a higher percent of carriage water to carry a unit of water across the delta without impacting the existing salinity in the delta. If it was maybe a little bit wetter year, that percent may go down.
Okay.
That's at least the theory. When you look at a series of years and the numbers that you see are 20, 20, 20, 25, 35, 30, 25, 30, 25. There are no numbers that are not a round number of 5 in a percent. There are no tenths of a percent. So obviously the accuracy of the calculation is not such that the people who are presenting the calculation feel like they can report it to anything other than the nearest 5%.
Okay. So your issue, it sounds like, is more about what you see as an issue with accuracy. It's not that there's an error. Is that correct?
Well, it's just that the fact that the number comes up to that is presented in the round fashion indicates to me that the people who prepared the number are not representing a very high level of accuracy, but instead more of an estimate.
Well, given the complexity of delta and the delta hydrodynamics, are you suggesting that it should be more precise and down to the 10th of a percentage or 100th of a percentage? Is that possible in your opinion?
Well, first, I don't think it's possible, but second, I'm suggesting that because the calculation is an estimate, then the use of the calculation needs to be appropriately moderated.
Okay. On page 16, you include a quotation from the scientific basis report stating that flow patterns in the South Delta, quote, under these conditions, unquote, create a hydraulic trap. Is that correct?
Yes, and just for fullness, the quote goes on.
Yes, in part, that's what it states.
Yeah, I would refer to the quote in the written testimony 72A as opposed to I shortened the quote a little bit for the presentation.
Yeah, I was looking at 72A, which I think is your testimony on page 16. Is that?
Yes.
So we're looking at the
Yes.
same quote. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sorry. There is a second sentence there. I was just, in part, you state that under these conditions, I'm sorry, let me read the full quote. You state that the flow pattern, I'm sorry, you quote that the flow patterns in the interior of the South Delta under these conditions create a hydraulic trap for particles or fish moving with the river's flow. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's from the scientific basis report.
Yes.
Okay. The phrase under these conditions, do you know what that's which conditions that's referring to?
Yes, they're referring to the during the times of high exports and low inflows. And it's a qualitative, I'm using it in a qualitative sense.
Okay. Well, can we bring up AHO 271 and turn to PDF page, I guess 119, and take a quick look at the quote? So AHO 271 is the 2017 scientific basis report. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you recognize this document?
Yes, that's where I took the quote from.
Yeah, okay. And can we blow this up a little bit, please? And so your quote is from the paragraph right in the middle of the page, the short paragraph right before 2.44. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it's the last sentence in that paragraph is what you quoted.
The last two sentences.
Last two sentences. Yes, thank you. Well, I guess the reason I asked you about the phrase "under these conditions" is I don't see any mention of exports in the prior two sentences in that paragraph. And so I guess I just wanted to, I see mention of null zones and then mention of South Delta irrigation demands and inflow from the San Joaquin River. So is your understanding is that under these conditions is referring to exports and not South Delta irrigation demands and low San Joaquin River inflow?
Well, I'll take a look at the last sentence of the paragraph above and starts with, this can occur when water that is blocked by the HORB, that's head of Old River Barrier, from entering Old River proceeds down the San Joaquin River and then is drawn into Old and Middle rivers towards the CDP and SWP diversion points. The reason that the water is being drawn down Old and Middle rivers towards the CDP and SWP diversion points is because of export pumping.
Okay, so that's how you're
Yes.
making that connection. Okay. Okay. On page 17 in paragraph 19 of your testimony, and we can take this exhibit down. You state that the DSM-2 modeling results for the 3 Southern and Central Delta compliance locations are not provided in the EIR, EIS. Is that correct?
Well, it's not provided in the appendix 6B1 that I looked at.
Yeah, are you aware, or have you learned since writing this testimony that information is in appendix 6B5?
Yes, in watching the testimony from Dr. Sadat, I believe.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, just a second. So moving on to, no, on this page, sorry, in paragraph 20 at line 13. I'm looking at the sentence that begins with the word however. You state, however, since the alternatives presented in the site's FEIR, EIS are all compared using monthly inflows, DSM-2 disaggregates these flows in a similar pattern, resulting in little to no changes between the salinity conditions modeled in the no project and proposed project alternative. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. With this, and I'm just trying to understand what your intent was with this sentence. Are you suggesting that monthly inflows to the delta in the modeling are not changing due to sites operations?
No, what I'm suggesting is that CalSim is looking at monthly inflows, and as such, does not look at any kind of sub-monthly variation of that. In order to introduce sub-monthly variation into the CalSim flows, which are then input into DSM-2, there's a method called, they call it smoothing the curve. And so what they will do is use a mathematical algorithm or equation to make the daily flows not be the same flow every day for April and then jump up to a different flow every day for May, for example, but instead show more of what would be a normal, a more normal or more typical type daily inflow, which would vary. What I'm pointing out is that when you only have monthly data from CalSIM2 and you need to enter that into DSM2, you have to decide how you want to break that down. And if you keep breaking it down in your project alternative and no project alternative in the same manner, again, you're going to hide some of the impacts. And then I'd also like to point out in the DSM2 run, another input that needs to be smoothed is the input EC at Vernalis. And just looking at the DSM2 runs that were provided by provided to Mr. Berg, the input for that was completely blocked. So there was no daily variation in the input from EC, the EC input. So what I'm talking about here is that without daily data to show various peaks that may occur in the beginning of the month or in the middle of the month or the late month and how those vary, you're not able to get a real accurate depiction of some of the sub-monthly impacts.
Are you aware of a tool that would provide inflow data on a sub-monthly basis?
The historical water availability analysis tool does that.
Well, that would fit in with, that would speak to DSM2.
That would see it. It will. You can use daily data and enter into DSM2, and then DSM2 will disaggregate that daily data on a 15-minute time series and put in tidal impacts.
If I could jump in here a little bit, since I guess this is a panel, I'd like to expand upon a little bit in terms of why that's important. There's a lot of variability in the re-exports from the site's reservoir project. And the variability causes the re-exports to be high with one day, low the next, maybe high for 3 or 4 days, then perhaps low again. And what happens when you take the CalSIM monthly value of all that variability, you come into a one smooth value for the month, and you lose that daily variability. And the reason why the daily variability is important is because the impacts that are felt in the delta are on daily, weekly levels. And if you take that variability, you smooth it out to just one single monthly value, then you're going to lose that variability that may occur as you turn the re-exports on and off from day to day or week to week.
I just want to clarify something, Mr. Wilson. And the first part of this, I just want to clarify that you weren't suggesting in the first part of the sentence that we just looked at that there is not a difference in inflows between the no project alternative and the project alternatives. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. In this same paragraph, paragraph 20, you suggest that the schism model would be better, but that it's not available, correct?
That's correct.
Would the schism model eliminate the monthly time step issue related to CalSIM?
No.
Okay. In page 18 in paragraph 21, you state that there's an absence of reliable modeling to predict impacts, correct? And is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and I assume based on the discussion we just had, you're in part referring to DSM-2. Is that correct?
Yes, and again, the combination of DSM-2 and calcium.
Okay. And then I know you're aware though that Mr. Burke, and relied on DSM-2 for a number of his analyses. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. In your conclusion in this paragraph, you state that the history of exceedances and the flow patterns in figure 2.4.3 indicate the potential for water quality impacts resulting from the addition of Clifton Court Forebay and Jones Pumping Plant as points of rediversion for the sites project, correct?
That's correct.
And the history of exceedances you're referring to are those you've identified in SDWA 73, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the flow patterns shown in figure 2.4-3 do not reflect the rediversion of sites water at Clifton Court for Jones Pumping Plant. Is that correct?
The way that I used figure 2.4-3 is in a qualitative sense. And so I really I came across that figure and I really liked it in terms of giving an understanding of how some of the basic functions of the delta. And so again, the conditioning of the addition of Clifton Court Forebay and Jones Pumping Plant with terms to prevent water quality, and then also I'm not talking about it in this paragraph, but also water level impacts it's happens all the time. It happens for all water transfers. So it's not out of the ordinary that additional water being released down to Sacramento River for export in the Delta during the summertime transfer window has the potential to affect water quality in the South Delta, and thus requires conditioning.
Okay. And in paragraph 23, you state that since D1641, the state board has used conditions for joint point of diversion operations to condition other water right actions, mainly water transfers that authorize the Clifton Court Forebay and Jones Pumping Plant's point of rediversions, correct?
Correct.
And that's what you were just speaking to in part?
Yes.
Correct. Okay. And your summary, the way I understand your summary of the board's rationale for doing so, explained in State Board Order 2001-03 DWR. Well, let me rephrase that. Hold on. Yeah, excuse me. So your summary of the board's rationale for including conditions on water transfers is explained, or is, excuse me, your summary for why the board does that is in part based on a discussion in Order 2001-03 DWR, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you state that in 2001-03 DWR, the board recognized that water transfers are not J-POD operations, but since the potential for injury to other legal users of water in the South Delta is similar, the transfer is conditioned on compliance with the water level response plan. Is that correct?
Yes.
So I'm really focused on the phrase you used, but since the potential for injury to other legal water users in the South Delta is similar, did the board in that order use that exact language?
No.
Are you okay, so you're kind of paraphrasing.
Yes, I'm explaining the rationale that the person who drafted those orders used to draft them first, then, and in the future. And that's what I used when I drafted those orders.
Okay, so you were the one drafting. Did you
Yes.
draft this order? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Do you agree that the board found within order 2001-03 DWR, do you agree that the order states that transfers are not solely responsible for lowering water levels and causing injury?
That's correct.
Okay. And so in this respect, it did not specifically find that potential for injury is similar as between J-pod operations and transfers, correct? And you may have already answered this.
Can you?
I'm just gonna, yeah, sorry, object vague, if you can maybe restate that.
Yeah, I think you already answered it by telling me about the intent of.
Yeah.
Okay. On page 20. I'm looking at lines 18 through 22. You state that from the standpoint of senior water right holders in CDWA and SDWA, these actions, which I believe you mean J-pod operations, transfers, and inclusion of Clifton Court and Jones Pumping Plant sites water right, are identical in that they result in additional export pumping at Clifton Court, Fort Bend, Jones Pumping Plant. Is that an accurate statement? Above that which was improved by D1641?
Yes.
Okay. In this sentence, what do you mean by the phrase above that which was approved by D1641?
I would just mean export pumping that requires an approval that is let me think for a second. An export pumping that is in addition to that which is approved by D1641 and requires additional action by the board to approve.
Well, you state at the end of this sentence results in additional export pumping above that which was approved by D1641. So it sounds like you have specific amount of export pumping in D1641 in mind in order to state that something's additional to it, correct?
Well, there isn't a specific amount, delineated that, okay, D1641 allows X acre feet of water to be diverted. But if water is diverted pursuant to D1641, whatever amount that is, if an additional amount of water is authorized by the board via water transfer, or this would be sites diversions, would be a permanent water right, that represents something that is above what was authorized by, or an amount that is larger than the amount that is authorized by D1641.
But D1641s establish specific export limits, correct?
There is an export limit objective in D1641. However, the export limit objective in D1641 is based on the inflow. So if the State Water Board approves the Yuba Accord, thus increasing the inflow to the Sacramento River, then that would increase the amount that would be able to be pumped absent the transfer action. And so that's what I'm talking about, an increase in the amount that would have been able to pump absent what the approval, the board's approval would be.
So you're, by this sense, you're not suggesting that these actions result in pumping above the limits stated in D1641. Is that accurate?
In that would be accurate unless there was the case of a temporary urgency change petition.
Okay.
So I think I understand what you're getting at.
Yeah, I'm really focused on the word additional.
Yeah, I'm not saying that maybe a better way to think of it would be that these actions result in pumping in exports additional to what would have been authorized by the D1641 and pursuant to the project's water rights. So the Bureau and DWR's water rights that are the CVP and SWP water rights. So maybe if that piece helps explain this.
Okay. Do you understand that the sites project rediversions at the South Delta pumps will be subject to all existing and future permits associated with operations of these pumping facilities?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't mean to interrupt, but would it be possible to take a short break?
We certainly, I was going to see Mr. Ferguson, how much longer do you think you have? I imagine you have some more. That's
I do
fine.
have a little bit more. Yeah.
Then let's go ahead and let us take a break. It is 10:14. Let's go ahead and come back at 10:25.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, it is 10:25. Ms. Taylor Scott, are you ready for us to go back on the
Yes.
record?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
So he's done?
And I think we have everyone here, so back to you, Mr. Ferguson.
Oh,
Mr. Wilson, I would like to return again to the sentence we were just discussing on page 20 at lines 18 through 21, in which you state that one of the similarities between J-Pod operations, water transfers, and the addition of Clifton Court and Jones Pumping Plant to as points of rediversion in the site's water right are similar. And one of those reasons you state there is that upstream reservoir releases that increase flow in the Sacramento River and result in additional export pumping at CFF JPP above that which would be approved by D1641. You state that as a similarity between the three. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I just want to go back to the phrase additional export pumping. I think I asked you about the amount of export pumping, but I also wanted to ask you about the rate, the pumping rates that are specified in D1641. And there are pumping rates that are specified at the export pumps in D1641, correct?
Yes, there are maximums. Yes.
I'm sorry for talking over you. You said maximums, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so you're not suggesting that the addition of, the inclusion of points of rediversion at Clifton Court and Jones Pumping Plant for this site's water right would result in pumping above those diversion rate maximums stated in D1641, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay. So more broadly within this paragraph or this portion of this paragraph on page 20, you've identified, I guess what I see as three similarities, what you believe are three similarities between J-Pod operations, water transfers, and inclusion of Clifton Court and Jones Pumping Plant as points of rediversion in the site's water right, correct?
You said that I had listed three.
Well, yeah, it appears to be about three, and I'll list what I see, and maybe you can tell me if you see any more there. The three I see that you identified you believe are similarities are that upstream reservoir releases that increase flow in the Sacramento River and result in additional export pumping above that which was approved by D1641. That's one. They both occurred, or they all occur, or would occur during the transfer window. That's the second one I see. And then the third is that they are treated by DWR and USBR similarly for the calculation of loss assumptions and carriage water. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And based upon what you believe are those three similarities, you suggest that rediversion of water at Clifton Court, Forbay, and Jones Pumping Plant pursuant to the site's application should be similarly conditioned. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then you include proposed conditions in paragraph 29, correct?
Can I step back a second, if that's okay?
Sure.
To the previous question with regards to similarly conditioned, I do want to point out that I do note that the what I'm calling sites rediversions, but if that's an okay term, are not limited in time, so they do not have an expiration date and are not did not, at least in the information that I reviewed, come with an annual acre foot maximum and a specific rate of rediversion at the export pumps as well. Maximum rate of rediversion.
Okay. And did you make that comment in relationship to the similarities we discussed or in relationship to the condition in paragraph 29?
The condition in both, the condition in paragraph 20, the similarities, just to point out that there are similarities, but there are also with the sites rediversion some areas that are areas where the approval would be more broad, I would say. That
And
is,
that you believe those reasons support the conditions you're suggesting in paragraph 29?
yes.
Okay. So my understanding is that in paragraph 24 of your testimony, you identify another potential impact that you believe supports your proposed conditions in paragraph 29. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you, in paragraph 24, you explain that additional export pumping has the potential to increase sedimentation and that this sedimentation is especially harmful to diverters along the Middle River, correct?
That's correct.
Did you offer any evidence indicating that additional exports associated with sites diversions would cause sedimentation in the South Delta generally or the Middle River specifically?
Well, I think it's the information that I had previously discussed in the previous paragraphs with regards to the increased diversions from sites that would be exacerbating the conditions of the current level of exports.
Well, with respect to sedimentation, have you offered any evidence connecting the site's proposed diversions to the sedimentation of the channels in the South Delta?
Well, I think the connection is that the site's diversions occur in excess of the current exports, and therefore would have additional impacts.
And I think we've shown
So-
in previous testimony, if I could jump in, that the exports are having an impact on the flow direction within the South Delta. And that change in flow direction, specifically within Middle River and Victoria Canal, I believe, is changing the way sediment is removed from the South Delta. It can no longer flow out through the system the way it naturally did. With the redirection of flows, it's now trapped to some extent within the South Delta. And because of that being trapped, it's now depositing out and creating some sedimentation issues in certain locations.
I was just going to ask Mr. Wilson, it sounds like your rationale is related to Mr. Burke's,
That's
are very similar to Mr. Burke's discussion and statements yesterday, where, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like both of you are suggesting that there's existing sedimentation. You claim it's related to exports, and therefore more exports are going to lead to more sedimentation. Is that a fair shorthand of the argument?
yes.
The claims? Okay. But again, at least Mr. Wilson, I'm going to ask you again, you haven't provided any quantitative analysis connecting through modeling or anything, connecting sites diversions to additional sedimentation in the South Delta, correct?
Correct. It would be qualitative.
Okay. And do you offer any evidence indicating that additional exports associated with sites diversions would cause null zones?
I think this qualitative assumption that based on the if you want to go back to the figure 2.4-3,
Okay,
it's but it'd be a qualitative
okay.
assumption or analysis.
All right, I would like to jump to paragraph 29, which are the conditions that you're proposing, Mr. Wilson, related to the issues we just discussed.
Okay.
And my understanding is, you suggest these conditions are necessary to address potential impacts of increased exports on water levels and sedimentation. Is that correct?
And water quality.
And quality. And you suggest that the board should impose stage 3 JPOD conditions on rediversion of sites project water at the export pumps. Is that correct?
Yes.
Stage 3 JPOD conditions are for operations of Banks pumping plant up to the physical capacity of the plant, correct?
That's correct.
And the physical capacity of Banks is 10,300, is that correct? CFS.
I'll defer on that as to what the current physical is.
Do you agree that, okay, so in your testimony, you recognize that the modeling assumptions for sites in for the EIR assume that Banks has the maximum operating capacity of 6,680 CFS. Is that correct?
I'm looking back right here in my testimony because I believe I talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's in paragraph 9.
Yeah.
That's where I was looking at about line 10.
Okay. So I'll look at starting on my line 11. CCF was assumed to have a maximum operating capacity of 6,680 CFS with additional diversions up to 10,300 CFS between December 15th and March 15th, depending on Vernalis flow, and then additional capacity. And so those are the modeling assumptions that were made for the sites project.
Okay. Well, based on this sentence, maybe we can return to the question about the physical capacity of Banks. Does it appear it may be as high as 10,300?
Well,
or is that a combined? Is 10,300 here a combined?
No.
Okay, so
the modeling requirements, as I do not think are requirements that are contained in that would be contained in any permit issued pursuant to application 25517. And so in reviewing the approval, I didn't note any requirements in what would be approved that would limit the pumping up to the physical capacity. And because the site's authorization as compared to a water transfer is of a more permanent nature, as in it doesn't expire automatically, then the range of what is possible pumping needs to be looked at into the future and far into the future. And so I think that the stage 3 joint point is requirements are most appropriate for the permanent nature of this approval.
But based on paragraph 9, you agree that the site's authority modeled the operating capacity at 6680 CFS, correct? Except for perhaps a unique exception.
Well, except for during the winter months. However, I don't think that the modeling necessarily limits the permit. So if the approval is such, unless the approval contained those same conditions, then the approval would allow. At this point, I don't see any limits on the rate of rediversion at Banks or at Clifton Court or Jones pumping plant in the proposed permit package. And so unless that were to be included in there, then the modeling limitations are just the limitations on what was modeled.
I assume you're familiar with the Army Corps permit limitation on Banks pumping, correct?
And
That holds Banks to 6680 CFS, is that correct?
yes,
Okay. And so and I think you previously acknowledged that you understand that the site's project is subject to all permits that apply to the export pumping operations, correct?
yes.
Okay. So based on the modeling and the recognition that existing and future permit conditions are going to apply, the site's project, that evidence indicates that the site's project is not indicating to use the entire physical capacity of the Banks pumping plant, correct?
I would disagree there. I think the modeling may show an intention, but the approval has got to be based on what we look at in the future as terms and conditions of it. So if you approve the project and the modeling had certain limitations, that doesn't necessarily mean that the future project will have those limitations unless you put those specific limitations into the permit.
But you understand that it's the Department of Water Resources and U.S. Bureau of Reclamation that own and operate the export facilities, correct?
Yes.
And they're the ones that hold the permits for those operations of those facilities, correct?
Correct. And so in a hypothetical, say, sites is approved without further conditioning in 50 years, if the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation look to modify that permit, then that would be something that would then apply to the sites diversions. And so looking forward to a case like that, I would say it'd be necessary to provide more, or it'd be necessary to provide permit terms and conditions to ensure that things such as the limits that you talk about that were modeled actually carry through to the project and its ultimate operation in the future. And what might be a far future.
Yeah, do you agree it's speculative to suggest that those permit conditions will be, specifically the Army Corps permit limitation, will be changed at some point in the future?
I don't think it's speculative. I think it would be something that would be necessary to, if it were even a possibility, then it'd be necessary to make sure that were addressed in the permit and the water right permit.
Is your understanding that Table 530 from Chapter 5 of the EIR, which you cite and we looked at yesterday, which shows south of Delta deliveries, is it your understanding that those deliveries assume the pumping limitations at the export pumps that we just discussed of 4,600 and 6,680?
So yes, these estimates of increased pumping assume the limits that are that were contained in the model run.
Okay.
However, those limits are not part of the permit, or not part of the proposed permit terms as I understand them.
Now I'm gonna jump back to pages 21 and 22 of your testimony in paragraphs 25 and 26. You discuss potential increases in salinity in the San Joaquin River due to deliveries to CBP contractors south of Delta.
That's
Correct. And are you, well, yesterday, I believe in table 530, we looked at potential deliveries. And would it be fair to say that the numbers we looked at, and I think they were included under the operational flexibility for the CBP, assuming that the maximum amount that's represented in table 530 for that category was delivered to those CBP contractors, is that amount fairly small, relative to the water use in the West Side CBP area?
it seems a little vague, but
Well, my recollection in table 530 for CBP operational flexibility, it showed in all years an average of 22,000 and in dry years maybe 60,000 acre feet. So I'm
yeah,
assuming that that's a category that might represent deliveries to West Side contractors at the maximum, correct?
correct. So if you assume the information in table 530, which is 60,000 acre feet per year in dry and critically dry years to be delivered to the CDP, and that would be a small amount, as you're saying, or if that is a relatively small percentage of the total volume of water that's delivered to that area, I would comment first that, again, then it might not be necessary to, that's why I propose not delivering the water there to avoid this problem, but also you point out that it's an incremental increase to an impacted area. And so in the sense that it is incremental, it needs to be addressed because it's an injury that's on top of a situation that has already been affected. So
Does the conclusion that there will be an incremental increase assume that there will be expanded irrigated acreage in this area with delivery of CBP water with delivery of water to CBP contractors south of Delta associated with the sites project?
can you repeat that one more time for me real quick?
I think you made a statement that there would be an incremental increase in what I think you're saying impacts, which I take you to mean salinity in the San Joaquin River due to drainage. Is that correct?
Yes.
And does that conclusion depend on the assumption that with delivery of this water, there will be an expansion of acreage that was from acreage that was not irrigated to acreage that's irrigated?
There could be that expansion, or there could be an increase in the amount of water delivered to each acre. So there could be an increase in the amount delivered per acre, or an increase in the acreage. What I would be concerned with is an increase in the resulting return flow or discharges. And so in order to avoid that, I recommend either removing the CVP from the place of use, or I think what would be my preferred method would be working with, having the parties work together to provide for some sort of flow on the San Joaquin River side to address these concerns. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a huge amount, and that can be something that's worked out in negotiation. But I think it's excuse me, it's very important to note that there is an increase. This is a known phenomenon, the drainage to the San Joaquin River. And if it's not a real big deal to the project, then removal of the CVP place of use from the site's project wouldn't be that big of a deal either. And so I think that's where, I look to the parties to weigh, the relative magnitudes and values that they place on these portions of this portion of the project. But I think any delivery, any increase of cross delta deliveries of water to drainage impacted areas in the CVP needs to be looked at very closely for impacts to water quality in the San Joaquin River, and thus injury to the legal users of water in the South and Central Delta.
Okay. I just want to clarify something. When I use the word nominal, I want to make sure you understand that I was not saying that those deliveries are not important, at least from the CVP contractor's perspective. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Okay, I was referring about nominal relative to the existing amounts of water that are delivered. We're on the same page there.
Yes.
Okay. Did you offer any evidence that indicates that any additional deliveries of sites water to these CVP contractors would, for existing irrigated acreage, would lead to additional runoff?
I didn't offer any specifics one way or another on that, but I do think in looking at it, the fact that you're increasing Delta exports, which is a clear, and again, I don't want to get back to the confusion about above D1641, but you're increasing exports above what D1641 authorized the projects to take. Then when you look at then the application of that water to area and the specifics in that application, I'm looking at the potentials if there are, further refinements to the deliveries to CVP contractors that may address this issue. That'd certainly be something to look at. However, I think in general, you've got to look at that at your absent the action case. So if you have CVP acreage that's irrigated as an orchard, and in the absence of the action, it would be irrigated via groundwater pumping instead of surface water pumping. Now you're looking at, well, would more or less water have been applied there? And would that have, you start to get into a lot of questions that really you want to look at and resolve by a negotiation between parties, looking at how did the looking into the specifics of those details. So for example, you can further refine the limit of not applying to the CVP by limiting it to areas that don't drain or have drainage programs set up. There's a lot you can do, but the basic tenet that these increased deliveries to the CVP have a real potential to cause drainage impacts, I think, is a underlying fact that exists.
Okay, but I just want to confirm kind of at kind of the field scale, you haven't done any sort of evaluation of whether these deliveries could lead to additional runoff. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Well, just looking at how normal irrigation practices are conducted, when you apply water to a field to irrigate a crop, you typically apply more than just the consumptive use for the crop alone. So you'll apply more water than is necessary for the crop to grow in order to keep the salt levels down in the soil. And then that additional water is then picked up by drains around the field. And so any additional water you'd apply, because you'll apply more than what the crop needs, will contribute to an increase in drainage return flows from that field.
Okay, Mr. Bird, that's a general statement about kind of agronomic irrigation practices. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That may or may not apply to the areas that might receive sites water within the West Side CVP, correct?
The actual irrigation practice may differ from farmer to farmer, but typically that's a concept of how it's applied to most fields.
Okay. Mr. Wilson, I am going to return to your comment about replacing groundwater with sites water, and that if it was a one-to-one replacement wouldn't change the runoff volume necessarily, would it?
No, but it could be of different quality and therefore affect the quality of that runoff.
Okay. Okay. So I think you mentioned this, Mr. Wilson, but based on your opinions about impacts to the impacts of sites deliveries to CVP contractors on the salinity in the San Joaquin River, you suggest that the areas of the CVP that drain to the San Joaquin River be eliminated from the site's project place of use, correct?
That would be one option, yes.
Okay. I think you mentioned you're aware of the in general, kind of the current no return flow programs and policies for the West Side San Joaquin Valley lands that drain to the San Joaquin River.
I don't think we brought this up yet. So,
well, I'll ask you, are you aware of those sorts of programs and policies in general?
I'm aware that since the adoption of D1641 and since the adoption of the 2018 plan, that there are numerous programs in place to attempt to address the salinity in the Central Valley and CVP places of use. But I'd also point out that these programs are in process. In some cases are multi-year programs that go out into the future. And so I would turn to the State Water Board in its recent approvals of water transfers still requires that the transfers not increase the amount of water pumped from the Delta or not result in increased drainage to the San Joaquin River. And so if these drainage improvement programs exist and are in place and could be included as conditions for delivery of water to the CVP, that may be something, a negotiated type of a settlement that can address this issue.
I think you've used this word phrase a couple of times, negotiated settlement. Are you referring to what are you referring to when you say that? You just used it a minute ago.
Yes, and I apologize for using the term settlement. If you look at page 24, line 16, or starting in line 16, I say that Central Delta and South Delta and sites could negotiate an agreement to allow for the delivery of water pursuant to the subject application to drainage impacted areas of the CVP in exchange for releases of water from New Melones to the San Joaquin River to address these water quality impacts.
Okay, so you're talking about an arrangement between sites and Central and South Delta to address some of these issues.
That's correct.
Okay.
And there's a wide range of what that could encompass,
Okay.
so.
I'm going to return to the kind of no return flow programs and policies and ask whether you're familiar with any evidence that indicates whether they're effective or have been effective.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I was just gonna object to, it's vague. Facts not. And assumes facts.
Well, are you aware of any evidence indicating whether the programs and policies are effective at managing drainage?
I'm not aware one way or the other.
Okay. In paragraphs 32 and 33, you discussed the state board's Sacramento Delta update to the Bay Delta plan, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And in paragraph 33, you suggest that the water board should impose conditions on the sites project related to this update that would require the sites project to accept the default objectives in the update or negotiate a separate voluntary agreement with the board, correct?
Yes.
Are you aware that the sites authority's application proposes that state water board standard term 96 applied to any permit issued?
Yes.
And I assume based on your experience, you're familiar with term 96.
Can we pull it up? Is that possible?
We can, yes. I sent an email earlier this morning that included the text of term 96, which could be helpful, and we could mark it.
I think we're working on it. We received that, so we're working on it.
And this is a standalone document that the site's application just simply stated inclusion of standard term 96 and not the text.
Correct.
So,
And while we're working on it, I looked up term 96 in April, May-ish and couldn't find it, and then ultimately was able to find it. So I have looked at it, but okay.
Okay, Mr. Wilson, I'll represent to you that I pulled this off the State Water Board's website.
Yes.
And so this is my understanding of what the current standard term 96 states. Does that look familiar to you?
Yes.
Okay.
And so
Let him ask a question. Yeah.
okay, so
Yeah.
And let me just interject, this will be marked sites 293.
So you see the last sentence of term 96 states, subject to appropriate procedure, the season of diversion and the maximum amount authorized to be diverted may be reduced to implement existing or revised water quality and flow objectives included in the Bay Delta plan, correct?
yes.
And so assuming that term 96 applies, there's no reason for the board to adopt the terms you propose in your testimony, correct?
I would disagree.
You don't agree that term 96 achieves the same purpose as your suggested terms?
Correct. I do not agree.
Okay, in what way does it not?
Okay. My reading of term 96 is that it's purely an informational term. And so it tells us that the board is in the process of amending the water quality control plan. And it tells us that subject to an appropriate procedure, and that's a little bit vague, but the season of diversion and maximum amount authorized to be diverted may be reduced to implement existing or revised water quality and flow objectives included in the Bay Delta plan. So I read that as purely informational. And honestly, if term 96 were in the permit or not in the permit is still subject to appropriate procedure. So maybe the season and maximum amount may be reduced based on just the continuing authority and continuing jurisdiction that the State Water Board has over all water right permits. And so the reason why I included my proposed permit term was to be a little bit more specific and actually require either accepting the default implementation of the objectives or to negotiate a separate voluntary agreement with the State Water Board. And so
Well, ultimately, if term nine, or I'm sorry, if an update to the Bay Delta plan is adopted by the board, which I assume it will be in the coming years, isn't term 96 saying that the permit will be subject to any conditions or any objectives that are adopted in that plan? Just like any other water right in the Bay Delta watershed would be subject to those objectives, correct?
yes, that's correct. And that's why I don't see a huge extra value in, or I see the value of the term as being an explanatory or a term that notifies, as opposed to something that is enforceable and has, teeth, so to speak, or has a requirement in it that must be met.
Well, the last sentence in term 96, doesn't it speak to the board's authority to reduce
Yes.
okay, so in that respect, if the term appears in the site's water right permit, the board would have authority through this term to limit or modify sites diversions in some fashion consistent with the objectives and any other appropriate evidence to support that determination, correct?
Yes, and the board has that authority whether the term is included in the permit or not. And so that was my concern with it, or my characterization of it as informational.
It seems to me with the suggestion of the terms in paragraph 33, you're suggesting that the site's water rights should be treated differently than any other water right in the Bay Delta watershed when it comes to compliance with these objectives. Is that fair?
No, I think the term that I crafted in paragraph 33 places sites in the category of the other water right holders that are of similar magnitude. And so the other large water right holders, and by large I mean that have high the maximum storage volume capacity of sites is in the top 5 or 6 in the watershed. The rate of direct diversion from Sacramento River is in the top of the watershed. And as a result, then the responsibility for the sites project is higher than for a project that may be much smaller in magnitude. And also let me add that I don't oppose putting term 96 in the permit. I just think additional conditions are appropriate.
But you do understand that when the board issues a permit to the sites project, it will have found that sites complied with all the statutory and regulatory requirements for issuance of a permit, correct? Just like any other permit that's been issued.
Yes.
The concern we have that with there is that it's not quite clear what happens to water that after it's rediverted out of sites. I know sites is obligated to conform to any existing environmental regulations and environmental regulations in the future. But once water is diverted out of sites and down into the delta, now when it's rediverted from the South Delta pumps, is it still obligated to the same requirements of the sites project because it's no longer part of the sites project at that point?
Yeah, Mr. Burke, I'm gonna, Ms. Kenzie moved to strike that as non-responsive, and it wasn't really
That's
related to my question.
that's fair. That
Didn't seem to
testimony.
be. Okay. In paragraphs 34 through 37, Mr. Wilson, of your testimony, you state that an additional reason the board should not include the CVP place of use in any permit issued to sites on assignment of state filing 25517 is because the state filing did not include the CVP place of use. Is that correct?
I would just slightly restate that
Okay.
as that the inclusion of the CDP place of use in the sites or in a anticipated future permit, the inclusion of the CVP of that would not be consistent with the original intention of the filing. And let me just here read this in my paragraph 35. The State Water Resources Control Board has a policy of looking favorably upon petitions for release of priority or assignment of state filed applications so long as the petitioner seeks to appropriate water for purposes and places of use consistent with the state filed application. So I would say that the inclusion of the CVP place of use would be inconsistent with the place of use with the state filed application as it was filed in 1977.
Do you agree that the statutory requirement for approval of an assignment is that the project not be in conflict with the general or coordinated plan?
Yes, I agree.
And so that you agree the standard is not that the project cannot be in conflict or not entirely consistent with the state filing, correct?
I would say that, and I was asked to look if the current proceeding is consistent with previous practices and policies of the board, and that's where I found reference to the board's policy. So I would agree that it is not a statutory requirement, but it is a policy of the board, and therefore that's where I'm raised the issue.
So are you aware that the state board has found that an applicant need not propose the exact project described in a state filing?
I would again fall back on the policy of looking favorably upon petitions so long as they seek to appropriate water for purposes and places of use consistent. So I would agree that it's not an absolute requirement, but I would also state that the board has had this policy, and if the board were to diverge or to not follow this policy, you would certainly want to have a reason why.
Yeah, but this policy, you agree, doesn't preclude approval of assignments for state filings where the project is different in some way than what's stated in the state filing, correct?
Yes, I would agree. It doesn't absolutely preclude it.
Okay. Okay, finally, I would like to return to SDWA 73, your spreadsheet, and ask you a few questions. And before we turn to this spreadsheet, or maybe we bring it up in conjunction, I would like to return to AHO 277 and read footnote 2 again. So can we go to AHO 277?
It's the D16 for the one.
And then turn to PDF page 194. And then scroll down to the bottom. And so Mr. Wilson, recall that, or let me just ask, my understanding is in your spreadsheet, SDWA 73, where you've shaded cells in yellow, you've claimed that those are the dates on which the South Delta agricultural salinity objectives are out of compliance with the rules stated here in table 2, correct?
No, what I state is that it exceeded the values contained in table 2.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And in order to determine whether there was an exceedance, do you agree that for the agricultural salinity objectives, you needed to evaluate whether there was an exceedance of the value using the maximum 30-day running average of mean daily EC?
Yes.
Okay. And does footnote 2 in table 2 explain how to determine compliance with an objective that's expressed as a running average?
It explains how to determine compliance expressed as a running average specific to this to where the footnote arrives. So I just don't want it to be broad that every time we're doing a running average, we would use footnote 2. But where footnote 2 is applicable, then that's how you would determine compliance.
Okay, can we scroll up to the top of this page? Do you see in the heading description unit?
Yes,
And then there's a 2 there.
yes,
And so is your understanding that that 2 refers to footnote 2?
yes,
Okay. So would you agree that, can we scroll back down? Would you agree that, stop please, that the footnote 2 applies to application of the 30-day running average for the South Delta agricultural salinity objectives?
yes.
Okay. And so footnote 2, do you, I would like to now go to SDWA 73 and ask you some questions. Do you need a second to read footnote 2 again, or are you familiar with it enough?
I'm familiar with it.
Okay. Can we go to SDWA 73, please? And can we bring up the OLD tab, please?
Scroll down.
Yeah, scroll down, please. Thank you. Okay, stop, please. So in SDWA 73, in the old tab in column D, my understanding is you've calculated the 30-day running average of EC in millimoles per centimeter for 2008, correct?
Yes,
Okay, and this is for the months, I believe you have March through November.
correct.
Okay. And to evaluate compliance with the 0.7 millimoles per centimeter objective for April through August in 2008 in column D, do you agree that footnote 2 in table 2 instructs us to start on April 30th?
That's correct.
Okay. And so if we start on April 30th in column D, footnote 2 instructs us to calculate the 30-day running average for the preceding 30 days, correct?
Yes.
So can we scroll down, please, so we can see April 30th? Okay, stop, please. So for 2008 in column D on April 30th, the 30-day running average is 661 millimoles per centimeter, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, since the 30-day running average on April 30th indicates the objective is met because it does not exceed 0.7 millimoles a centimeter, the prior 30 days are not identified as exceeding the objective at that point, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then footnote 2, my understanding is it would require us to proceed to calculate the 30-day running average for each subsequent day until we get to a day where the 30-day running average exceeds the threshold, correct?
Correct.
And for 2008 in column D, the 30-day running average of 0.7 millimoles a centimeter is not exceeded until June 14th, 2008. Is that correct? And we can scroll down if we need to.
Oops. So yes, for example, I see June 16th,
Okay, can we scroll down, please?
where based on rounding,
Let's get down to the scrolling part.
But on June, do you agree that on June 14th, that's the first day that the objective of 0.7 millimoles a centimeter is exceeded, correct?
no, I disagree. Because of rounding, 722 rounds down to 0.7, 742 rounds to 0.7, 763 rounds to 0.8.
Okay. Well, if we use your rounding and we then for 2008 in column D, the 30-day running average is not exceeded until June 16th, 2008. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So my understanding of footnote 2 is that the 30 days making up the average as of June 16th would be exceeded, would exceed the objective. Is that correct?
Yes, and would be considered exceeding it for the entirety of the previous 30 days.
Yes. So that would mean that back to, I believe, May 18th, the objective would have been exceeded according to the rule, correct?
Yes.
And so does that mean that the entire month of April in column D should not be shaded in yellow?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. I think it's 11:25, so I'd like to keep going here. I will turn next to Mr. Soderlund. I believe you're next on my list. Do you have questions for these witnesses? I believe you do.
And I'll defer to
I think you have an echo.
I got questions for both Mr. Wilson and Mr. Burke, and I'll just give Mr. Wilson the discretion.
Mr. Soderlund, you have an echo. I think, do you have multiple devices on, possibly?
I don't. I not. But you still hear an echo?
Yes. It's like you're in a grand cave, so it won't work very well.
That's horrible. Can I ask off? Or anyone have?
I would suggest let's go ahead and take maybe try logging out and logging back in. Sometimes that magically fixes things.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you.
Phone, say phone.
Mr. Burke. We'll see if this works.
Is that any better?
Let's try again. I can't tell yet.
Keep talking.
Well, now it sounds like you're cutting in and out. There may be a microphone problem.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how you want to proceed. What I can do is go get my cell phone and
Now
join.
now it sounds fine. let's give it a shot, and I will. And please, Ms. Taylor Scott, let me know if you have any difficulties hearing. But let's try and go forward. Go ahead, Mr. Soderlund.
Nothing like technology to make you feel kind of uncomfortable and uncertain, throw you off a little bit. Make this work. I do have questions. Well, good morning, Mr. Burke and Mr. Wilson. My name is Eric Soderlund. I'm an attorney for the Department of Water Resources. I've got questions for you both individually, and so I'll just give the direction to Mr. Wilson. Do you want to take a break, or you want to keep going, or would you like me to go to Mr. Burke first? It's up to you.
I'd like to take a break. I would like to use the restroom.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Mr. Burke, good morning.
Good morning.
If we could bring up your testimony, and I look on look on my sheet, and I actually don't have it labeled as far as what it is. I can find it real quick for Ms. Bowen. It is Delta Water Agency 2, right? Today?
That's correct. Number 2.
We can bring that up. I think that'd be helpful.
So that's SDWA 2.
2A.
2A. That's right. 2A. Thank you.
And if we could go to page 4, paragraph 6, lines 14 and 15. In that paragraph, you state that any increase in CVP or SWP exports will worsen the impact that these diversions are having, correct?
That's correct.
What's the baseline exports that you refer to?
The baseline exports that we evaluated in the analysis is no exports. So that became in this analysis, the no export alternative. And then we compared that to the existing exports that have historically been occurring within the Delta.
So just to understand that answer, you're saying any export will have impacts. So you're going back to a no export condition?
We found that through the hydrodynamics of the Delta, using DSM-2 as our modeling alternative, that the exports that occurring today are causing problems in terms of reverse flow and slowing down water so sediment drops out, and it's causing a lowering of the water surface elevation within the delta. Now, if you add on to that, any additional exports will only worsen that condition in that scenario.
So it's you're saying any addition to what DWR and or reclamation could divert without sites, without just any exports that the projects could divert under their own water runs, any increase to that will cause harm. Is that your testimony?
That's correct. Any increase over what exists today will aggravate the existing situation and make conditions worse.
And what evidence or analysis did you rely on to make that statement?
We based that on the DSM-2 model from that DWR has produced.
So what model runs did you conduct to make that analysis, and what additional exports did you include?
What we looked at was the DSM-2 version 8.2.1. We took the historic model run that's distributed with the model, and from that model run, we removed the exports from the system so that we ran that standard historical model run from DWR without any exports. Then we put the exports back into the DSM-2, ran a second scenario that allowed us to see how the hydrodynamics in the system would change with the exports. And then we went at different locations through the delta, comparing what the stage would be with and without exports.
Okay. So again, because we're changing baselines here. I don't want to testify. It seems to me that there's different baseline. Your testimony is that the modeling runs that you conducted were with exports and without exports, correct?
Two separate scenarios, one with exports and one without exports.
But you did not run any modeling to demonstrate the impacts of additional exports related to sites, correct?
No, we didn't run any scenario that included the site's exports because the amount of those exports haven't been solidified yet. But looking at the hydrodynamics of the system, any increase in exports, whether it be from sites or any other source, is going to increase the conditions that are causing problems within the delta.
So you didn't run the modeling runs because you don't know what the exact number of exports is, correct?
That's correct.
In your testimony, I believe you reference on average 97,000 acre feet per year. Is that correct?
Yeah, we looked at the models that were provided us by the sites team for CalSim2 and for DSM2 for the different project alternatives. And we looked at the average annual volume that they had included in exports from their models. And that averaged to about 94,000 acre feet per year.
Could you have run 97,000 acre feet per year in a modeling run to show any impacts?
We could run that.
And did you?
No, we didn't run that because that's not a solid number yet. We're hoping that the sites team will converge upon a number that they feel is appropriate, because the actual exports could, based on what I've seen so far, they could range from 97,000 or 100,000 on up to 300,000. And that's a wide difference, and it would have a big difference in the potential impacts.
Correct, but your testimony is that any additions will cause impacts, correct?
That's correct.
So you could have run 97,000 acre feet per year to show those impacts, correct?
We could have run that. Yes, that's true.
But you didn't.
No, we didn't run that.
Okay. And then in your testimony on page 5, paragraph 8, line 5, you state that the increase in exports, although relatively small, will incrementally worsen the existing impacts of the CVP and SWP project operations, correct?
That's correct.
Can you quantify the incremental impact of exporting sites project water?
If we had a solid number to evaluate in our analysis, we could quantify that.
Do you believe that a relatively small increase will also result in a relatively small increase in impacts, if there are?
I believe the impact would be relatively proportional to the increase in exports that would occur at the diversion point.
Would any change in exports cause harm? And I'll stop there. Would any change in exports cause harm?
Any change in exports could cause harm. What hasn't been analyzed is what is the level that will start to cause harm. Now we know even without any increase in exports from the sites project, there is already harm being conducted in the Delta. There are periods when farmers can't irrigate. There is a reduction in flow into different sections of the river that prevent agricultural users from exercising their water right now without any increase. So any increase, whether it be a small increase or a large increase, is only going to make that condition worse.
In figure 2 on page 7 of your testimony, if we could scroll to that. You state that it's a plot of the stage in Old River during April of 2001, correct?
That's correct.
And you're showing the stage difference of exports with exports and without exports, correct?
That's correct.
Is there a reason why you chose the month of April?
I don't believe the month of April was a critical factor, but I did want to select 2001 so we could look at a critically dry year when things can be exceptionally bad in the South Delta.
Is it your understanding that temporary barriers are in place in April? Generally?
I understand that they're in place on various years, and sometimes the dates when they're actually installed can vary.
But are they in place generally during April?
I'm actually not sure the exact installation date.
Does this plot include the impacts of installing temporary barriers?
If the temporary barriers were installed on that date, as incorporated in the model released by DWR, then this plot would represent the existence of those barriers on that date.
I just saw that, did we lose, oh, there's Miss Kinsey. Sorry. I'm trying to spy on you, Miss Kinsey. I just,
I was gone. I was gone, and now I'm back. So I apologize for that. I'll review either the video or the transcript if I missed anything.
We didn't really cover anything. I don't think while you were gone, that was a very quick exit and re-entrance. So your testimony is that plot of April 2001, you do not know if the temporary barriers were installed or not, correct?
My understanding is that the historic model released by DWR that covers this period has the actual time periods of when each of the barriers went in and was removed built into the model. So that model should incorporate the barrier if it was in place on that month.
Okay. Is it your understanding that sites water will be exported in April?
I didn't look at the exact months that sites water could be exported, but I know that you can export at almost any time of the year, depending on when the specific water users might need that water.
Would you, so you're not familiar that sites water is planned to be diverted or re-diverted during the transfer period as identified in the biological opinions?
No, I didn't look at the exact period of when water could be diverted. I only looked at what the impact of that diversion would do to existing conditions in the Delta.
And when you say you looked at the impact of what that diversion would do in the existing conditions of the Delta, you didn't look at the incremental impact of the rediversion of sites water, correct?
No, we didn't perform an incremental analysis of how much each increment of rediversion would cause or what that impact would result in water levels within the delta. But we know from the hydrodynamics of the system and how the system responds to exports that any increase in exports is going to have a corresponding increase in the reduction of water level within the delta.
And what evidence or analysis do you rely on to make that statement?
The DSM-2 model runs.
And did you provide those model runs?
Yes, I did.
Okay. In figures 3 through 5 on pages 7, 8, and 9 of your testimony, you state that these figures show the difference in water level for each of the 3 representative locations. I think Old River, Middle River, and Sugar Cut, comparing with and without exports, correct?
That's correct.
And what factors did you consider in choosing those representative locations?
I just thought that there were 3 locations that represented conditions at 3 very different channels in the South Delta. So you could see the general impact of how these diversions are affecting not just Old River or just Middle River, but different channels within the system.
Why did you choose why did you choose the particular time period, the range of water years reflected in those figures?
I thought that it was a range that would provide something that's relatively recent, so we were not relying on historic hydrology, but it also provided a series of years that had an even distribution of wet, dry, critically dry, above and below normal years. So you can see a variety of responses based on water year type.
But they don't reflect the recent 20-year period of the hydrologic period, correct?
Not the full 20-year period, no.
Based on those figures of 3, 4, and 5, are there times when exports have less effect on stage? No, we could bring them up. It doesn't matter. We could do figure 5 on page 9.
But I would have to agree with that statement. As you can see in the figure itself, you can see that there are periods when you have, going back to figure 3, for example, if you look at the time series of that stage reduction through 1998 and the 2010 water year, you can see there are periods when you're actually getting a reduction in stage of up to 2 feet, but yet you're also getting periods when you're only getting about a half a foot stage reduction.
And based on your understanding, what would account for that difference in stage impacts?
It would probably have to do with spring and neap tides. It would have to do with the amount of diversions that are occurring, since the diversions aren't consistent at all times through the year.
And based on your understanding, do these tables or figures include the impacts of installing temporary barriers?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part of that.
Do you know if these figures include the impacts of installing temporary barriers?
Yes, they do include those impacts.
If we could go up to page 9.
Should we
Paragraph 10. Sorry.
Yep, SDWA, it's 2A, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And then
Right.
page,
I haven't been paying attention. I guess I
We
want to
were-
stay on. I want to stay on SDWA just for reference, just to make it easier for everybody to follow along.
yes, and we normally would. What happened is that all of the State Water Board employees were simultaneously booted off of Zoom at the same time, which is why we lost the figure. But we're back on now.
Guess you got to pay the rent or something.
Yeah.
All right. So page 9, paragraph 10, line 17 through 18. you state that even a 1/10 of a foot difference in water level can make the difference between being able to divert water from the channel and not being able to divert water, correct?
That's correct.
Why did you use a 1/10 of a foot in that statement?
The 1/10 of a foot was brought out to highlight the fact that diverters are already having problems diverting water from the delta channels or the south delta channels. And so what happens if they're close to not being able to divert and they're just barely able to get water out of the channel, even a 1/10 of a foot reduction in that water level could mean the difference between able to divert and not. Once you start getting close to the bell of the pump intake, you can start drawing air in from the water surface above it, and bringing that air into the pump can cause cavitation and damage to your pump system. When you're already having a problem, then a 1/10 of a foot can be an issue. Now, if there were no problems with irrigators in the delta, then maybe that 1/10 of a foot would not be an important issue. But since they're already running into problems where they can't irrigate during some periods, that 1/10 of a foot could mean the difference between not irrigating and being able to irrigate.
1/10 of a foot is fairly specific. In drafting your testimony, did you know that corresponded with the most significant drop in stage level identified by the site's evidence?
No, I hadn't heard that before. This is a number that I've used in conversations with farmers and other water users in terms of, we're at our wit's end right now, and we were having trouble irrigating. Even a 1/10 of a foot could make a difference. And so that's kind of stuck in my head. So that's why I included it in this passage.
Is there any place in your testimony or the evidence you provided to demonstrate that exporting sites water will result in a stage reduction of a 1/10 of a foot?
No, there isn't. But I wouldn't call that 1/10 of a foot a criteria that they're trying to not meet. But I would say, even if they did cause a 1/10 of a foot or a 1/5 of a foot or an 1/8 of a foot or a 1/16 of a foot, any increase is going to aggravate the existing problem that we have in the channel. I didn't intend for that 1/10 of a foot to be a criteria to meet or not meet.
When you state the channel, in your previous sentence of even a 1/10 of a foot will make a difference in diverting from a channel, is there a particular channel you have in mind?
No, that's just more of a general description of the delta rivers in the South Delta.
Is it your testimony that there will be a stage reduction in all channels in the Central and South Delta due to exporting sites water?
We found that given the exports that exist today, there is a stage reduction through most all of the channels. We haven't actually looked at the very end of Old River, perhaps near the Old River at San Joaquin River confluence. But every place we looked at, we saw a reduction in stage due to the exports. So I would assume that if you increase those exports, that subsequent reduction would probably work its way through most of the South Delta channels.
And did you provide the evidence to support that statement you just made?
No, I didn't. It's just my knowledge of the hydraulics of the system and how those perturbations from one end of the South Delta channels will perturbate through the rest of the South Delta channels. Now it's going to be diminished and gradually, peter out at some point, but we haven't seen that actually happen. We haven't seen any location where there isn't a reduction in stage due to exports.
And again, you didn't provide any evidence to support that statement, correct?
No, just my expert knowledge of the system and experience in running the DSM-2 model.
Is it your testimony that a reduction of a 1/10 of a foot will make a difference in all channels and with all diverters in the South and Central Delta?
From my conversations with farmers and water users, any reduction, whether it be a 1/10 of a foot or less, could potentially throw them into a situation where they can't irrigate. Right now, they are already in positions sometimes where they can't irrigate. And so I'd have to ask sites team to come back and tell me, well, how much can they reduce without causing an impact to the farmers that are trying to irrigate from these South Delta rivers and channels? They haven't done an analysis that I'm aware of that lets me know what they think is an acceptable additional reduction to water level in these different channels.
So it's your testimony that 1.2 inches reduction in stage will affect all diverters in the South and Central Delta?
No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying that is any reduction in stage could potentially cause an impact to the diverters that are presently diverting from the South Delta channels. What that diversion or what that reduction would need to be can differ from location to location, depending on the pump setups and the nature of the channel that they're trying to draw water from.
Did you provide any evidence to identify which diverters would be impacted by a 1.2 inch reduction in stage?
No, we haven't done an analysis diverter by diverter through all the diversion locations within the South Delta. But I would hope that if that is an issue, and I think the Sites Authority understands that there is an issue with water stage in the Delta, that they would be able to come up with that analysis to let us know how much of a reduction is acceptable at each of these different locations.
Well, if you're the one who's claiming the harm, would it not be easier for you to identify who would actually be harmed?
I'm just going to object to the question. The burden is as asked. The burden is being switched. It's the burden's the other way around.
I sustain, but I think you can try it. If you want to try again, Mr. Soderlund, I think you can. But to the extent there was a legal assumption, I think, embedded in the question, which did make it confusing.
I'm trying to get a feel for how many diverters would be impacted by 1.2 inches reduction. And would it be your understanding, Mr. Burke, that it would be a limited number of diverters that would be that sensitive?
I would be hesitant to say what number would be impacted by that, because I don't know exactly what the level is of the intakes for all the diverters that are within the South Delta, and whether they're within any specific 1.2 or 2.3 or 5.6 inches from the existing water level during high or low tide. It would differ from each location, and I wouldn't necessarily, since almost all of the diverters are having issues now, it seems like even without any reduction, there's already a harm being conducted or being impacted to the South Delta diverters. At what point do you take a harm and make it worse? You know, we're not saying that everything's fine and drop it down 1.2 inches and then all of a sudden you have an impact. What we're saying is the impact is already there. They're already finding periods when they can't irrigate. So lowering it an additional amount, how small it may be, only reduces their ability to irrigate from the South Delta channels. It's not a threshold of now everything's good and then something would be bad. Everything is bad already now, and it's only going to make things worse.
But you don't provide any specific evidence or a specific diverter that would actually be impacted, correct?
Yes, we play. To some extent, we did when we analyzed the effect of the reduction in water level and its impact on the ability to bring water into Tom Paine Slough.
We'll get to Tom Paine Slough. That's great. On page 10, paragraph 12, lines 15 through 17. Of your testimony, you state that the change in flow pattern caused by the project exports also impacts the flushing of salinity out of the delta, allowing for increased salinity levels in the existing channels. Sorry, increases in exports will worsen this condition. You state that, correct?
That's correct.
What do you mean by increase in exports? I think we've covered this, but I just want to clarify.
We're looking at any increase in exports from the South Delta export pumps.
Are you looking at increase in the export rate at the South Delta pumps as allowed for by the current permits?
I believe, yes, that it's an export rate that is presently incorporated into the model at the South Delta export pumps.
So are you claiming that any exports in addition to, let's say, 6680 CFS, correct?
No, I'm not talking about a threshold of what the allowable pumping rate is from any of the existing pumps, but any increase in exports However, it should be, or it will be distributed among the different pumps that are there. And any increase from that, whether it be through the Jones or, Clifton Court Forebay, will result in a change in the flow pattern or an increase in that change that we see today.
And this is kind of going to the discussion that Mr. Ferguson had with Mr. Wilson. And I'd like to ask those questions to Mr. Wilson too, but I think it's important to understand that you understand that the sites project will not result in DWR petitioning or requesting a change in its permitted export rate capacity, correct?
Yeah, I haven't incorporated that in any of my analysis, and that is not an issue with what I've done in my testimony.
So again, when it's made the statement of increase in exports, it's referring to the situation where water available to DWR. If it's okay, I'll just focus on DWR. When you're saying the increase in exports, you're referring to the situation where water available to DWR under its own water rights.
I'm sorry, you're cutting out a little bit.
Apologies. Good old technology. When you're referring to an increase in exports, you're referring to a situation where water available to DWR under its water rights is less, water available to be rediverted is less than the export capacity as allowed for DWR's permit. And thus, any water from additional sources to be pumped under that capacity, that's increase in exports, correct?
I'm just going to object. The question is overly compound and vague.
Fair enough. I'll give it a shot. Increase in exports is any increase in export pumping in addition to water under DWR's water rights, but under the capacity rate allowed for, correct?
We kept it a little even cleaner than that. We were just looking at any increase in exports, independent of CVP or SWP or independent water contractors, any increase in exports above which is exported today. And we're assuming if that's allowed to happen, it'll be within the permitting requirements, that will cause or result in a reduction in water level and a change in flow patterns within the South Delta.
Is it your understanding that would only happen during certain years when there's capacity available?
It could be sporadic, depending on when there was capacity available and when months that were allowed diversions to be conducted.
Will exporting sites water cause DWR to operate at a diversion rate higher than was analyzed and allowed for in D1641?
I haven't incorporated the D1641 requirements into our analysis. What we're looking at is just the response of the Delta to any increase in the exports that exist today. We're assuming that those exports, I'm sorry, we're just assuming that those exports would be conducted within the water right constraints that are applied upon those exports. So it's independent of any water requirements, but just the physics of the system itself and how it responds to an increase in exports.
So in a year like this year, where DWR, well, I'll give it a hypothetical. I don't want to testify. In a hypothetical year where DWR is able to export at its export capacity with water under its own water rights, the impacts that you're talking about are already happening, correct?
The impacts, yeah, the reduction in water level due to exports is already occurring. That's correct.
And when sites, and if sites water is not being diverted, it's not increasing those alleged impacts, correct?
Not during those particular months. We looked at the proposed sites diversions over the course of the 2021 or 1921 through 2003 period. And for those months that they do have diversions, sometimes it's a large increase over what the existing diversions are for the CVP and SWP, sometimes up to 10,000% increase in flow rates and that diversion. During other months, it's actually a decrease in the diversions that are occurring. You had some months that had a 5,000% decrease in flow rate. So it's scattered across the months and the years, depending on when they're able to divert and when they anticipate needing to divert through the South Delta export pumps.
On page 11, moving on, paragraph 13, lines 21 and 22 of your testimony. You state that the change in flow in the Middle River as a result of project exports have prevented the sediment in the channel over the years, correct? Have prevented the sediment to flush. Or, well, I think I miswrote that. You know, sometimes when you're writing these questions, I don't know if I got it, but you say the change of flow has prevented the sediment from adequately being flushed out of the river, correct?
Well, the change in flow pattern in Middle River, specifically from dominant direction of downstream to now it's pooling up and flowing upstream, has reduced the ability for the river to discharge sediments downstream and out of the delta. Now those sediments, when you're moving upstream, are more locked into the river system and have a longer period of time for which they can settle out and silt in the channel.
And have you conducted any analysis to support that claim? That
No,
exports increase the sedimentation?
No, there's presently not a sediment transport model that's been developed for the Delta. And so borrowing a model that's been developed by the sites project team to evaluate this, we went back to first principles of what causes sediment movement and deposition in channels. By moving the channel and having the flow go upstream, you're now changing the direction of sediment loading in the channel to now, instead of being exported through the system, it's now going to be reintroduced into the system. You're slowing down the river flow. The delta barriers, which are intended to help keep the water level high, also slows down the flow. And when you slow the flow down, you give the sediment a longer period of time to settle out and deposit into the channel.
So speaking of the transport of sediment, do you know what velocity of river flow is necessary to transport sediment?
It varies depending on sediment size. For, smaller green particles like silts and clays, you might be able to start transporting sediment at, a 1 foot per second or half a foot per second. For larger sediment sizes like sand grains, you might have to go up to 2.5 feet per second to mobilize those bed loads.
Do velocities reach that level during the summer months in most years?
Sometimes they do, yeah, depending on the tidal level.
Sometimes.
That's correct.
Can you clarify what sometimes is?
I don't have a specific time frame, but since it's a tidal system, sometimes there's no velocity in the channel at all. And sometimes you have a high velocity, depending on which direction the tide is going and whether you've reached the maximum high tide or the minimum low tide.
If velocities in the channels don't reach the level you mentioned, 1 foot per second, or 2.5 to 3 feet per second. If the velocities don't reach that level to transport sediment, is it still your testimony that exports increase sedimentation?
Yes, if the velocities don't reach that level necessary to mobilize the sediment movement, sedimentation will occur and aggregate in the channel.
Do the exports affect the velocity in the channels?
I believe they do, yes.
And what evidence or support to support that statement?
The fact that they're changing direction in the channel and that they're now putting in the barriers, which slows the channel down, creating a longer period of no flow movement within the system.
Is it your testimony that the barriers have impacts?
I believe I mentioned
Sorry,
it.
that's a vague question. Hold on, I'll never rephrase this. Um, I'll scrap that one. On lines 21 and 22, I believe in the same paragraph, you further state that the increased exports expected with sites will only further decrease flushing of Middle River and increase the amount of sedimentation, correct?
That's correct.
Assuming for this question that this statement is correct, have you done any analysis to quantify the incremental impact of exporting sites water to increase sedimentation?
No, we haven't run the incremental increase in exports from sites because they don't have a fixed number for us to evaluate.
But you're at testimony that any increase would cause an impact, correct?
Yeah, from our review of the hydrodynamics of the system and how it's responding to the existing exports, my opinion is that if you increase those exports, you're going to increase that resulting change in sediment dynamics for the system.
Are exports the only cause of sedimentation in your opinion?
No, there's many different causes for sedimentation. The exports are just one of the factors that are affecting them, and a factor that has a fairly large impact because of the fact that it's actually changing the direction of the river itself. And that's the biggest factor that's changing the sediment dynamics is now sediment is not moving downstream out of the system during most of the year, but rather up into the system where it then has a chance to settle out and silts in the channel.
But you conducted no analysis to actually support that statement, correct? You don't rely on any modeling or papers that support that statement, correct?
We rely on the modeling that we've conducted with DSM-2 to evaluate the change in the flow characteristics of the channel, given the existing exports that we see today versus a no export condition. And so looking at that and evaluating how the system is responding to those exports, we can attest that if you increase those exports, you're only going to aggravate that scenario.
But that's based off your assumption, not on any sort of analysis that you
It's
can
based
point
on our,
to.
I'm sorry, it's based on our review of the results of the DSM-2 model.
But the DSM-2 model only talks about the change in flow direction, correct?
That's correct.
It doesn't get to whether that would cause an increase in sedimentation, correct?
No, it doesn't address sedimentation in the model itself. It's only our evaluation of the model results.
Moving to page 17, paragraph 17, lines 3 through 5. You state that given the lower depth of flow in the channel due to sediment buildup, it is likely that the impact from the project exports will be greater than is presently predicted by the model, correct?
That's correct.
And what analysis did you rely on to support that statement?
We didn't perform an analysis by updating DSM-2 to all the channel changes that have occurred within the delta. But looking at the system, you know, if you change the channel depth to make it shallower, now the impact from those exports are going to have a much greater effect on that flow level. If the exports are changing the flow level a half a foot, and you now have a channel that's 2 feet shallower, that half foot change in stage that's resulting from the exports is going to have a much greater impact on the ability to irrigate from that channel. Because now you're going down, instead of from a 5 foot deep channel to 4.5, you're going from a 2 foot deep channel to a 1.5 foot deep channel. And that will have an impact.
Have an impact on what?
On the ability to irrigate from those channels.
Is it your understanding that the diversion methods can float on top of the sediment? I'm trying to understand that when we're referring to diversions, are we talking about pumps?
Yeah, these are pumps, fixed pumps that are on stands that are out in the middle of the channel that are pulling water from the channel.
And and then with those fixed pumps, if the sediment goes up, do the pumps also move up with the sediment?
I'm not sure if anybody's making adjustments to their pumps based on the sedimentation that's occurring in the channel. What typically happens though, as the channel silts in, the pumps start drawing more sediment into the bell of the pump, and it causes wear and tear on their system, and also becomes sediment that falls out in their irrigation ditches in each of the fields that then has to be cleaned out at a later date.
So if the sediment is increasing, how would water level have an impact on that pump?
Because the water level is relatively fixed because of the tidal range that we see in the delta. You're not going to, if the channel goes up in a riverine system, the water level would go up correspondingly. So you have a direct relationship. But in a delta channel that's subject to tidal fluctuation, as the channel goes up, the water level doesn't necessarily change. It still stays within that normal tidal range, minus any reduction that's due to the exports that are occurring within the South Delta. So as that channel comes up, the only thing that happens is it just gets shallower and shallower, and making it harder to draw water from the pumps. Does that make sense?
It does. I don't. I don't want to turn this into a conversation, but I am interested because it in my mind, as sediment comes up, that's what's filling the pump. It doesn't necessarily mean the water level is below it. I guess my question, here's the question, is water level reduction, as long as it's above the pump, it doesn't matter, correct?
Well, it has to be a certain distance above the pump to avoid vortices from forming and pulling air down into the pump bell. So you're going to need, I'm not sure, it probably differs from pump to pump, but you need a foot or two of water above the pump to prevent that from happening. And so when we're talking about sedimentation in conjunction with water level decrease, it's kind of like you're getting hit from both ends. The water level is coming down, the bottom of the channel is coming up, and the farmers and the irrigators are being caught between those two processes, making it, untenable to irrigate it when they need it sometimes.
And I guess that's my question is as the bottom comes up, the pumps don't come up with it, correct?
I'm not aware of any farmers that are raising their pumps, given the fact that the water level is lowering. Raising the pumps would be problematic in itself.
So if the bottom's coming up, it seems to me that that's more of the issue. Would that be a correct understanding?
At some locations, it might be. It's not the same at every location, and it's not necessarily even the same from year to year, because as I mentioned in my testimony, these sediment wedges sometimes move around within the system. Sometimes you'll find it at one location, then next year, based on the flow characteristics of the previous year, it may be at 100 yards downstream. And then maybe you'll have a area that's scoured out, and then you'll have three more, sediment fields that have silted in beyond that. It's a dynamic situation that's changing from year to year. And the location of these particular sediment areas aren't necessarily going to be in the same location each year. But what we found in looking at the channel as an overall system is that you can see a gradual building up of the sediment from year to year within the system, although not necessarily uniformly across the length of the channel.
I believe that the increase in sediment is just a factor of it being the delta.
Delta sediment dynamics are a very touchy and critical thing, but you can change those sediment dynamics by changing the direction of flow in delta channels. And that can have a dramatic effect on how the sediment's moved through the system, how fast it's moved out, or if it's even moved out. And to the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen any studies conducted by DWR or the sites project team that analyzes that situation to determine whether or not that impact is going to be critical over the years.
Have you conducted any analysis of diversions in the South Delta and how they impact sedimentation?
To the best of my knowledge, most of the diversions are removing water from the delta. They irrigate their fields with this diverted water, The water then runs off of the fields or infiltrates into the ground and is picked up with drainage channels along the perimeter of each of these fields. And from that perimeter drainage channel, the water is pumped back into the delta channel that's nearby. I have not seen any scour erosion occurring in these perimeter channels. They're relatively stable from what I've been able to see, but I haven't conducted any study of that, so no, I haven't.
Do you believe that south delta diversions could impact flow rate in those channels?
It's possible if all the diverters were diverting at the same time, it could have an impact on flow.
Going to page, looking at, on page 18, figure 14 of your testimony.
And maybe Mr. Soderlin, can we do a quick time check, at least with respect to Mr. Burke?
Yeah, we could take a break. I mean, I don't have that many more questions, but I don't know how long it will take.
Sure, sure, fair enough. So it's 12:16. I think it probably is a good time to go ahead and take our lunch, which would be my intent, and then we could come back and pick up with Mr. Burke, and I know you have questions for Mr. Wilson as well.
Could we possibly get a sort of a time check and estimate of what's left in terms of cross of this panel after lunch?
Well, didn't we go through this yesterday? Let's see.
I don't know if that's changed after what's occurred so far.
So far.
How long have I gone? How long have I gone for? I haven't been paying attention. When did I start? If anyone can tell me.
I didn't note it down. So my team says 50 minutes.
I've gone 50 minutes.
Yes.
I would expect maybe 15 more minutes for Mr. Burke. And then I would like to go a lot faster for Mr. Wilson. I'll try to speed it up. So maybe be done with the plan by 1:30 for me. But no, that's 12.
Well, we're taking lunch.
Depends when we come back. What was your estimate? I'm sorry, what was your estimate for Mr.
I
Wilson?
said half an hour.
Okay.
For Mr. Wilson.
That's 45 minutes.
Yep. And then Ms. Mitchell, I know you've told us, I think you said an hour, but do you have any revision or addition to that?
Yes, good afternoon. We do not have any additional questions for this panel. Thank
Oh,
you.
so you have no questions for this panel?
No questions.
I see. Understood. So that helps. And then Ms. Mendel-Rice, do you have any update?
I will still have questions, but we're slowly crossing them off the list. So my guess is 20 minutes, maybe 30, but hopefully 20.
Okay, great. That's helpful. Mr. Reese, did that
Thank you. That helps.
answer your
Yes.
question?
Thank
And-
you.
Yeah. Is there anything else we should address before we break for lunch? All right, let's go ahead and plan on coming back at 1:15 and plan on logging back into the Zoom. I will see you all at 1:15.